My grandmother's lawyer slid a small envelope across the table, and for a second, I thought he had made a mistake. My cousins, Nolan and Erica, were sitting across from me in tailored black clothes that somehow still looked expensive enough to announce they had no intention of grieving modestly. They had already received the first part of the reading. Nolan got $2.5 million. Erica got $2.5 million. My Aunt Barbara got my grandmother's jewelry, Herr Silva, and what she kept calling the legacy pieces, as if grief was just another form of inventory. Then the lawyer looked at me, cleared his throat, and said, "Leah, your grandmother left you this." Inside the envelope was a rusty key. Not a sleek little safety deposit key. Not anything elegant or ceremonial. It was a heavy, old-fashioned brass key with dark orange rust gathered along the teeth and a faded paper tag tied through the round bow with string so old it looked like it might dissolve if I breathed on it too hard. For a second, no one said anything. Then Erica laughed. Not loudly. Worse. Softly. The way people laugh when they want to make sure you know they think you're small. "Oh my God," she said, pressing her hand to her mouth. She literally left Leah a junk drawer item. Nolan leaned back in his chair with the kind of pity men perform when they feel superior enough to be generous with it. "I'm sure it means something sentimental," he said. Barbara turned toward me with her polished, sympathetic expression. The one she used at funerals and fundraisers and church luncheons. "Your grandmother always knew you were the sentimental one." The lawyer, Mr. Heller, looked uncomfortable. There was also a note. He opened a second folded sheet and read it aloud. "Leah, Elder House. Start with the blue door. Look up. Love always." Grandma. That was it. No explanation. No legal speech. No dramatic revelation about hidden treasure. Just a rusty key. A cryptic line. And two cousins, trying not to grin too openly while pretending they felt bad for me. I remember the room with painful clarity. The polished walnut table. The air conditioning that ran too cold. The faint smell of paper and lemon furniture polish. The way the rain tapped against the tall office windows as if the weather itself had shown up to underline the mood. Everyone in that room thought I had lost. And in the version of inheritance people understand fastest, I had. Before I tell you what that key opened. Tell me where you're listening from. I always want to know how far these stories travel. And if you've ever had to build a boundary with people who only remembered your value when they needed something, type "never again" in the comments. Because that phrase would end up meaning more to me than I knew that day. I curled my fingers around the key and felt the ridges bite gently into my palm. I should tell you this. I was the granddaughter who stayed. That sounds noble when people say it at a funeral. It sounds noble when a neighbor squeezes your hand and says your grandmother was lucky to have you. But living it is less poetic. Living it looks like canceled weekends. Late-night pharmacy runs. Sorting pill organizers under yellow kitchen light. And learning exactly how tired a person can get while still functioning because there isn't another option. For the last 18 months of my grandmother Eleanor's life, I was the one who drove the 90 minutes from Portland to Ashby 3 times a week. Then 4. Then almost every day. I brought groceries. I called contractors. I sat through doctor appointments. I fixed the printer she refused to replace because, according to her, machines become arrogant when they know they're young. I knew how she liked her tea. Strong? Not delicate. I knew which step on the back porch dipped half an inch lower than the others. I knew she hated the new lamp Barbara bought for the sitting room because it gave off what she called a desperate kind of light. My cousins knew none of that, but they knew the value of her brokerage account down to the decimal. My grandmother had money. Yes, old money. But not in the glossy magazine sense. Not yachts and art auctions. It was the kind of money built slowly and quietly through property. Discipline. And the radical habit of not wasting things. Her father had bought 3 buildings in Ashby before the downtown area meant anything. Her husband, my grandfather, had expanded those holdings after the war. My grandmother had protected them through recessions. Bad to none. 1 flood. And 2 family members who always had an emergency right after she said no. Barbara was her eldest child. And the closest thing our family had to a self-appointed CEO. She spoke in polished conclusions. She wore cream blazers and pearls that looked expensive without being warm. She loved appearances, narratives, and being thanked. My father, her younger brother, had died when I was 24. My mother had died long before that. By the time my grandmother's health started slipping, I was the nearest relative without children, which Barbara treated as tragic proof that I had too much time, and my grandmother treated as a practical fact of geography. I never moved back to Ashby. I stayed in Portland and worked as an architect with a small preservation firm. But over time, Ashby started tugging harder. First because Grandma needed someone to drive her after her cataract surgery. Then because the dishwasher flooded. Then because Barbara had a charity board meeting. Nolan had plans. Erica had a migraine. And somehow the only person with a flexible enough life to absorb the family's falling bricks was me. At first I told myself I didn't mind. Then I told myself it was temporary. Then one snowy Tuesday in February, when I was on hold with an insurance company for 41 minutes, while my grandmother slept in the next room and the furnace rattled like it was arguing with God, I realized something uncomfortable. People in my family did not see me as dependable. They saw me as absorbent. I took impact well. I had been doing it since I was a child. When I was 9, Barbara forgot to pick me up from choir practice because Erica had a dance fitting. When I was 13, Nolan borrowed my laptop and returned it with a cracked screen. Then said it was already like that. When I was 16, Barbara told me, in a voice smooth with fake concern, that I should think about practical options for college because some people are built for stability, not brilliance. My grandmother heard that one. She was slicing peaches at the kitchen counter when Barbara said it. And I watched her set the knife down very carefully before turning around. Barbara, she said. Not everyone who speaks with confidence is wise. Barbara laughed. Because that was what she did when she wanted to turn correction into theater. But my grandmother never laughed with her. She just turned back to the peaches. And later, when Barbara had gone, she pressed a peach slice into my hand and said, "People who underestimate you are often outsourcing their own fear." That was my grandmother. Never sugary, never sentimental for long. She loved with precision, which is why the key hurt. Not because I thought she owed me millions. I need to say that clearly. I did not spend those months helping her because I expected a payout. If she had left every cent to a cat sanctuary and a brass band, I would still have driven her to appointments, but she knew the room I came from. She knew how Barbara translated everything into a ranking. She knew what it would mean for me to sit there with a rusty key while Nolan and Erica got millions, and all the visual proof of importance that money creates. So I drove to Alder House in a storm. Half angry at my family and half angry at her. Alder House sat on the edge of downtown Ashby, on a street most people passed without seeing, because newer businesses had shifted 2 blocks over. It had once been a boarding house, then short-term apartments, then, for a while, an object lesson in what happened when everyone remembered history but nobody wanted to pay for repairs. I knew the building. Of course I knew it. As a child, I'd gone there twice with Grandma to help deliver boxes during winter coat drives. It had a narrow brick face, old iron railings, and a blue side door that swelled in damp weather. I also knew Barbara hated it. She called it a burden property, an emotional asset, something people kept only because they were too nostalgic to behave rationally. The street was empty when I parked. Rain ran down the windshield in silver threads. The brick looked almost black in the wet. I got out with the key in one hand and my grandmother's note in the other, my boots sinking slightly into the soft edge of the curb. The blue door was on the side alley, under a flickering wall light and a rusted metal awning. I stood there for a second with the rain cold at the back of my neck, staring at the chipped paint and swollen frame. Start with the blue door. Look up. The key fit. That was the first thing that made my pulse jump. Not because it proved anything grand, but because it meant this was deliberate. She had not sent me on a sentimental scavenger hunt. She had sent me somewhere real. The lock resisted, then gave with a thick metallic click. The door stuck halfway. I had to put my shoulder into it. And when it finally moved, a breath of old air rolled over me, dust, damp wood, old plaster, and something faintly sweet beneath it, like dried cedar. The entry hall was dark. I found the switch by memory and was startled when the sconce actually worked. Weak amber light spilled over cracked tile. A mail cubby built into the wall, and a staircase that climbed upward in a narrow turn. Everything looked paused. Not abandoned. Covered furniture. Clean enough baseboards. A building waiting. Look up. I stepped back into the threshold and tilted my head. Above the inside of the door frame, where the molding met the wall, there was a small wood panel that didn't match the paint. My grandmother had told me, "Once, that buildings always confessed if you looked at them long enough." I dragged over an umbrella stand, climbed up carefully, and pressed the panel. It popped free into my hand. Inside the cavity was a leather document tube, a ring of smaller keys, and a cassette recorder. I stared at them for a long moment before taking them down to the floor. My hands were shaking now. Not wildly, just enough to tell me the center of the day had shifted the layrand. The recorder had one label in my grandmother's handwriting. For Leah, play alone. I sat on the dusty bench beneath the mail cubbies and pressed the button. There was static first, then the scrape of fabric, then my grandmother's voice. Thinner than I remembered, but unmistakably hers. "If you are listening to this," she said, "then Barbara has already tried to look compassionate. Nolan has mistaken cash for victory. And Erica has laughed at least once." I actually laughed then, a startled, wet little sound that came out half sob. "Good," Grandma said on the tape, as if she had heard me. "You're still capable of laughter under pressure. That matters." I pressed the recorder tighter to my ear. "If I left this correctly, you are in Alder House. I am sorry for the theater of the key. But some truths are safer when greedy people underestimate them. Your cousins would have torn apart anything they believed had obvious value. They have always respected spectacle more than substance. I needed them looking at the money. I closed my eyes. Outside, rain hit the alley light with a steady metallic hiss. "Leah," she continued, "Alder House is not a burden property. It is the anchor. In the tube are the deeds, trust documents, and my letter to the board. In the desk on the third floor are the ledgers Barbara hoped I never understood. Though I understood them perfectly. Do not confront her until you have copied everything. Mr. Heller knows there are additional documents, but he does not know where. That was intentional. He is honest, but he is not imaginative. I can still remember the feeling that moved through me then. Not joy. Not yet. First came vindication. Hot and sharp. Then came grief. Because in the middle of that dark hall, with a cassette recorder humming in my hand and rain knocking at the door, I understood that my grandmother had seen all of it. Every fake smile. Every convenient absence. Every time Barbara redirected conversation when I spoke. Every time Nolan and Erica treated my labor like background music. She had seen it all. And she had planned accordingly. If this part of the story already sounds familiar to you, comment, same. Some families don't ignore truth because they can't see it. They ignore it because seeing it would force them to give up the roles they enjoy. I opened the document tube on the bench. Inside were property deeds, incorporation papers, a trust packet, a sealed letter addressed to the Alder House Preservation Board, and one set of typed instructions with my name at the top. The trust was called the Eleanor Whitmore Community Trust. The primary asset was Alder House and the surrounding 3 parcels. 3 parcels. I read that line twice. I knew the building itself had value, especially if restored, but the surrounding parcels changed everything. They connected the side alley to the back lot and the old carriage building, which meant development control over nearly half the block. The current appraised value, according to the last filing, was just over $11 million. I sat there in the dust, dripping rainwater onto my jeans, holding papers that made the millions Nolan and Erica had just inherited look suddenly less definitive. But the money was only part of it. The trust named me sole acting trustee for 10 years, with authority over restoration, leasing, sale restrictions, and a charitable housing initiative my grandmother had apparently been building quietly for years. There were grant letters, preservation pledges, a local foundation partnership still pending, notes in the margin in her handwriting. Ask Leah if second floor north rooms can hold natural light studio. Check structural beam before winter. No luxury conversion. People first. People first. That phrase was underlined twice. The next hour passed like a fever dream. I climbed the stairs, turning on lights as I went. The building was worn but not dead. The second floor had 4 former apartments, stripped but sound. The third floor held a large office, a common room, and an old oak desk shoved against the window. The smallest key on the ring opened the center drawer. Inside were ledgers, notebooks, formal accounting ledgers, dated across 4 years, each cross-referenced with invoices, deposit slips, contractor estimates, and handwritten notes in my grandmother's narrow blue ink script. And there it was. Barbara had been skimming, not in giant, obvious ways. That would have been easier to catch. She had done it like a person who thought decent people never checked detail. Inflated contractor charges, duplicate repair reimbursements, emergency maintenance bills for work never completed, transfers from the Alder House account to a consulting entity registered under one of Nolan's LLCs. Over and over. Small enough to hide, large enough to matter. My grandmother had circled them. In one margin, she wrote, Barbara mistakes delay for blindness. In another, Nolan signs what benefits him and calls it family trust. By the time I reached the bottom ledger, my anger had cooled into something more useful. Clarity. I took photographs of everything. Every page. Every transfer. Every note. Then I called Mr. Heller. He answered on the second ring. Leah, I'm at Alder House. Silence. Then, carefully, "You found it?" "Yes," I said, "and I found more than I think you were told." His exhale was slow. "Your grandmother informed me there were supplementary materials tied to a separate trust. She said you would locate them if you paid attention. She did not disclose the contents. There's a trust worth over 11 million. I said, "And ledgers that appear to show Barbara siphoning funds from Alderhouse accounts?" Another pause. "Do not call your family," he said immediately. "Do not mention any of this until you bring those documents to my office. Can you do that tomorrow morning? I can do it tonight." "No," he said, his lawyer voice surfacing in full. "You can lock the desk, take the trust packet, and come to me at 9. And Leah? Yes? If the documents say what you believe they say, this is no longer a family misunderstanding." That sentence settled over me like a door closing, because that was the thing about my family. They loved misunderstandings. Misunderstandings were soft. Misunderstandings allowed people like Barbara to say things like, "This is painful for everyone, and surely we can discuss this privately." And let's not make a bigger issue of what was clearly an accounting confusion, but numbers are stubborn little witnesses, and my grandmother had given me a building full of them. That night I barely slept. I spread copies across my dining table in Portland and moved through them until almost dawn. Drinking reheated coffee and hearing my grandmother's voice in every margin note. There were tenant histories, repair schedules, letters from women who had lived at Alderhouse after leaving violent homes, draft proposals for converting the upper floors into long-term transitional apartments, notes about preserving original woodwork because dignity is not a luxury item. And woven through all of it was Barbara's theft. Not just money. Intention. She had not only stolen from the building, she had tried to starve the thing my grandmother cared most about because she wanted it sold. Solfest? Sold clean. Sold into the kind of polished redevelopment that gets praised in magazines and empties a town of anyone who doesn't photograph well. The next morning, Mr. Heller read in silence for 45 minutes. I watched his face sharpen as he moved through the trust packet, then harden as he reached the ledgers. Finally, he removed his glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose. "Your grandmother was more strategic than I realized. She knew Barbara would go after anything obvious." "Yes," he said. "She also knew your cousins would take liquidity over stewardship." That part was exceptionally well predicted. "What happens now?" He folded his hands. "First, we secure the trust. Second, we retain a forensic accountant. Third, we notify Barbara that Alderhouse and the attached parcels are not estate residue and never were. They sit outside the will in a private trust. Her children's distributions remain what they are. But they have no claim to this property unless a court finds fraud in the trust itself. And the ledgers?" He looked at me directly. "If they hold up, Barbara has larger problems than disappointment." News traveled through my family with the efficiency of spilled perfume. Barbara called me before noon. I let it ring twice before answering. "Leah," she said. "Too bright. Darling. I've been thinking about yesterday, and I just wanted to make sure you were all right. It must have felt strange. Strange is one word. Well, your grandmother could be theatrical. Could she?" A tiny pause. "I hear you've been speaking with Martin." "Mr. Heller?" I corrected. Her tone cooled by 1 degree. "He mentioned there may be additional papers related to Alderhouse." "There are." Another pause. Longer this time. Barbara shifted strategies. "Leah, whatever this is, I hope you know family doesn't need to become adversarial. If there are sentimental complications, we can work through them together. That sentence told me everything. Sentimentale complication. That was what she thought she was dealing with. A girl with feelings and a building she loved for emotional reasons. I leaned back in my chair and looked at the spread of ledgers across my table. I'm sure we'll discuss it soon. I said, good. Because Nolan and Erica are already fielding calls about whether the property might be sold. And I would hate for confusion to create tension. Barbara? Yes? I think the tension is already there. Then I hung up. By the end of the week, the situation had widened. The forensic accountant confirmed the missing funds pattern. The trust was valid. Properly notarized. Independently witnessed. And funded years earlier. My grandmother had transferred Alder House and the parcels into it long before her final illness. Which meant Barbara couldn't argue coercion. Mr. Heller sent formal notice. Barbara responded through her attorney. Nolan sent me 3 texts, each more aggressive than the last. Erica posted a photograph from some rooftop restaurant with the caption, "Grateful for legacy and blessings," which told me 2 things. First, she had already started spending. Second, she still thought image could outrun substance. Then the city entered the story. Ashby had been quietly planning a downtown preservation corridor. Alder House sat at the hinge point between the old district and a new transit-linked redevelopment proposal. Because my grandmother had secured the adjacent parcels. The trust now controlled not only a historic building, but a key access route every developer wanted. The latest valuation came back at just over $17 million before grant matching and tax credits. $17 million. I stared at the number for a long time. Not because it made me feel triumphant. Exactly. Money doesn't erase humiliation as quickly as people think it does. It doesn't travel backward and sit beside you in the lawyer's office, so your cousin stops smirking in real time. But it did something almost as useful. It changed who had to call whom. Suddenly, Nolan wanted to grab coffee and talk possibilities. Erica wanted to make sure the family remained aligned. Barbara wanted a calm, strategic conversation, before outsiders complicated things. I said no to coffee. I said no to private meetings. I said all communication would go through counsel or happen in documented settings. That was the first real boundary I had ever kept with Barbara without softening it halfway through. And it changed the air between us immediately. People who benefit from your flexibility often experience your boundaries as cruelty. Barbara certainly did. She began a careful smear campaign in Ashby. Nothing vulgar. She would never risk obvious malice. Instead, she used implication. She told people I was overwhelmed. That grief had made me reactive. That Alder House was emotionally symbolic to me, and she worried I might make irrational choices. She suggested the family had always tried to support me, but I had a complicated relationship with being helped. That line got back to me through a florist whose daughter had once lived at Alder House during a rough year. Your aunt thinks we don't know how your grandmother really felt. The florist told me, tying ribbon around peonies with angry hands. But your grandmother talked. She just chose her audience. I met with the preservation board 2 weeks later. The room was packed. Ashby is small enough that real estate and old family money count as entertainment. And my family had given the town both. Barbara arrived in a cream coat and pearls. Nolan vore navi? Erica wore grief like a brand partnership. I wore a charcoal sweater, black trousers, and the calmest face I could manage. Mr. Hela sat beside me. So did the accountant. On the agenda, officially, was the future of Alder House. Unofficially, everyone knew what this was. Barbara spoke first. She was elegant, persuasive, and full of concern. She talked about family strain, about honoring my grandmother's memory, about practical stewardship, about how large properties required experienced hands. She never once said the word money. which was the clearest possible sign that money was all she meant. Then Nolan spoke about opportunity, redevelopment, efficiency, growth. He had the confidence of a man who had spent his entire adult life being congratulated for rooms other people built. Erica spoke last and tried a softer tack. She said she loved the idea of honoring Grandma's spirit, but worried I might be carrying too much alone. She used my name often. Leah this, Leah that. It was the verbal equivalent of putting a hand on someone's shoulder so the audience would think you were kind. Then Mr. Heller stood. He outlined the trust. He explained its formation date, governance rules, and preservation restrictions. He clarified that Alder House and its parcels were not part of the probate estate. He confirmed that I, not Barbara, held decision-making authority as trustee. You could feel the room tilt. Barbara's face did not move much. But I had known her too long not to see it. A tiny hardening around the mouth. The look of a woman realizing her script had just been removed from her hands. Then the accountant spoke. Not dramatically. That was the beauty of it. He was methodical. Dry. Almost dull. He explained discrepancies. Duplicate invoices. Unsupported transfers. Related party payments. Misapplied reimbursements. He projected dates on a screen. Amounts. Entities. Signature trails. Nolan's name appeared twice. Barbara's appeared 18 times. For the first time in my life. I watched Barbara lose altitude in public. She tried to interrupt. He kept going. She said there had to be context. He said the ledgers had context. And he was showing it. Nolan said the numbers were being framed unfairly. The accountant asked if he disputed his own signatures. Erica started crying quietly, which under different circumstances might have moved me. But I had watched tears function as tactics in my family for too long to mistake sound for remorse. Then Mr. Heller nodded at me. This had always been part of the plan. Not revenge theater. Truth spoken at the exact point where narrative stopped protecting the wrong people. I stood up with my grandmother's final letter in my hand. The room was so quiet I could hear the heat clicking in the wall. My grandmother asked that this be read if Alder House ever became a point of conflict. I said. She wrote it 6 months before she died. I unfolded the paper. If you are hearing this, then someone has mistaken ownership for appetite. That was how it began. A small ripple moved through the room. My grandmother had a way of entering a space even in absence. I kept reading. Alder House was never intended to become luxury property, family leverage, or a final feeding ground for people who appear only when value has been polished for them. It exists because shelter matters. Dignity matters. Place matters. A family that knows only how to liquidate will eventually sell its own name. Leah understands the difference between a thing that can be sold and a thing that must be kept. Barbara closed her eyes. I read on. To my grandchildren, cash is easy to admire. Stewardship is harder. If you received money from me, enjoy it honestly and leave this house alone. If you are offended that I trusted Leah with responsibility, ask yourselves when responsibility last interested you without applause attached. You could feel the words landing. No shouting. No courtroom objection. Just truth. Placed exactly where it had nowhere to hide from. Then came the line that changed the room completely. For the record, Barbara's handling of Alder House funds has been under quiet review for years. I delayed legal action while I was alive because I hoped shame might restore what greed had thinned. If it did not, I leave the matter to Leah with full confidence that she will choose firmness over chaos. Firmness over chaos. That was my grandmother's gospel. Barbara stood then, because sitting had become impossible. This is grotesque, she said. A dead woman's bitterness. weaponized by a child who wants to feel important. I looked at her. For years, that kind of sentence would have split me open. The contempt, the reduction, the insistence that my seriousness was vanity. But grief had done something clean inside me. So had the ledgers. So had the months of driving home exhausted while people who contributed nothing still believed they ranked above me in the family order. I don't need to feel important, I said quietly. I need you to stop pretending your greed was management. That was the line people in Ashby repeated later. Not because it was flashy, because it was true. And truth said plainly is harder to wriggle away from than a performance. If you've ever watched the family favorite Panic when the facts finally arrive, type truth below. That moment rarely looks as glamorous as we imagine. Usually it looks like silence, paperwork, and a person discovering charm has terrible handwriting. The fallout took months. Barbara's attorney tried to negotiate, then to threaten, then to minimize. The more records surfaced, the worse it got. Some of the diverted funds had moved through Nolan's real estate shell company. He swore he thought the payments were legitimate management fees. Whether that was stupidity or lying hardly mattered by then. Erica called me one night around 11. I almost didn't answer. When I did, she was crying for real this time. The ugly kind. Uneven. Breathless. I didn't know. She said, I knew Mom pushed. I knew she always wanted the building sold. But I didn't know it was like this. I leaned against my kitchen counter and stared at the dark window over the sink. What do you want me to say? I don't know. She inhaled shakily. Nolan says you're humiliating us on purpose. He was comfortable when I was the one being humiliated. That's not fair. I almost laughed. No, Erika. I sat in that lawyer's office holding a rusty key while you laughed at me. I thought... She stopped. I thought Grandma had made some strange sentimental gesture. She had. It just wasn't strange. The line went quiet. Then she said, very softly, did she hate us? That question surprised me. Because beneath the shopping bags and the rooftop photos and the perfected brows, there it was. The child's question, the one image management never fully erases. No, I said. If she hated you, she would have left you nothing. But she trusted you. Yes. Another silence. Did you know she was doing this? No. Then why you? I looked at the stack of plans on my table. Structural assessments. Window repair estimates. Notes from the housing nonprofit. My grandmother's handwriting in the margins. Because I would show up after the reveal too. Erica cried harder at that. And I hated that I understood why. Nolan never made that call. Nolan doubled down. He spent fast. Invested badly. Talked loudly. Treated his inheritance like proof the universe had finally recognized his potential. Within 8 months, one restaurant deal collapsed. One condo flip stalled. And one girlfriend with strategic teeth left him for a man whose money was less theoretical. Barbara aged in a way I had never seen before. Not physically, though that too. It was more that the atmosphere around her thinned. People still greeted her in town. Politeness survives many things. But the certainty that once walked 2 steps ahead of her no longer did. Some doors opened slower. Some invitations didn't come. As for me, I worked. That was the thing people rarely understand about vindication. It is not a feeling you lounge in. Real vindication usually arrives disguised as administrative burden. I spent mornings with contractors and afternoons with grant writers. I met with preservation architects, housing advocates, structural engineers, and a retired banker who had adored my grandmother and cried when he saw the trust charter. I learned that restoring old windows costs more than replacing them, and matters anyway. I learned that dignified housing requires better lighting than most people budget for. I learned that the city moved faster when the person in charge spoke calmly and documented everything. And slowly, Alder House came back. The blue door was repaired but kept its color. The first floor became community offices and a shared kitchen. The second and third floors became 8 transitional apartments for women and children moving out of emergency circumstances and trying to stabilize before their next step. The carriage building became studio space and legal aid meeting rooms. We restored the original staircase. We kept the old mail cubbies. We sanded floors that had held a century of footsteps and found oak under all the dirt. I named the central common room Eleanor Hall, not because my grandmother needed a plaque to be real, because I wanted every person who walked in there to know the building had been protected by a woman who understood that assets reveal character. The opening day was bright and cold. Ashby turned out. Of course it did. Towns love redemption almost as much as scandal. Especially when they get to wear coats and hold coffee while attending it. Reporters came. The preservation board came. The florist came. 2 former residents of Alder House came with flowers and stories, and eyes wet with memory. Barbara did not come. Nolan wasn't invited. Erica came quietly and stood near the back in a navy coat with no performance in it at all. I saw her before the remarks began and felt something in me settle. Not forgiveness exactly. More like a recognition that collapse had finally reached the part of her where truth could land. When it was my turn to speak, I stood in the common room under restored crown molding and looked at the faces in front of me. For a second, I saw my grandmother's kitchen instead. Steam on the window, tea dark in her cup. Her saying, in that dry voice of hers, "People who grab first rarely understand value." So I began there. My grandmother believed a house tells the truth about the people who keep it. I said, for a while, Alder House told the truth about neglect, greed, and what happens when people mistake cash for legacy. Today it tells a different truth. That dignity can be repaired, that shelter matters, and that what looks small in the right hands can change a lot of lives. That line made the paper, but the moment that stayed with me came afterward. As people moved through the rooms and the buzz of conversation rose around the coffee table, Erica approached me holding a folded brochure from the opening packet. "I need a job," she said. No preamble, no sisterly tone, no fake lightness, just the sentence. I looked at her. Her hair was simpler than usual, her makeup lighter. She looked older. Not in a bad way, just less padded by certainty. "What kind of job?" I asked. "An honest one?" That almost made me smile. "I'm serious," she said quickly. "I know how that sounds. I'm not asking you to rescue me. I'm asking if there's a place here where I can work and earn something real." In the old version of my life, I would have softened immediately. I would have rushed to make her comfortable so my strength didn't look cruel. But my grandmother had not given me this house so I could rebuild the same family dynamics under nicer lighting. "There might be," I said, "but it would come with rules." She nodded too fast. "Okay, you report to the operations manager." "Not me. You don't use your last name for leverage. You show up on time. You do the work assigned. Not the work you think looks better. And if you ever treat the residents here like props for your redemption story, you're gone." Her face flinched at that last line, which meant it was necessary. "I understand." "No," I said gently. "You understand the sentence? Understanding the rule takes time." She swallowed and nodded again. A week later, she started part-time at the front desk. Not because I had become soft, because boundaries aren't only about doors closing. Sometimes they are about deciding the exact size of the door and who is allowed through under what terms. Nolan called once after that, from a number I didn't recognize. I let it go to voicemail. He said the market had been rough, that some deals had turned, that family should be able to talk, that maybe there was a role for him in expansion since he had development instincts. I deleted it without replying. Barbara sent one letter 6 months later. Not an apology. Barbara did not speak that language fluently. More a rearrangement of blame into something she could survive. She said grief had distorted everyone. She said my grandmother had become susceptible to suspicion in old age. She said she regretted the unpleasantness. At the bottom, she wrote, in her careful script, I hope one day you'll remember I did my best with what I understood. I stared at that sentence for a long time. Then I folded the letter, put it in a drawer, and went back to work. Because maybe she had done her best with what she understood. And maybe what she understood had always been too small. That was no longer my inheritance to carry. About a year after the opening, I was in the hallway near the blue door when one of the residents' little boys asked if this had always been a house for people who needed help. I knelt down and looked at the chipped brass plate beside the frame. Polished now, but still old. No, I said. It had to become one. He accepted that answer immediately. The way children accept truth when it is simple enough. And ran back toward the kitchen where someone was slicing apples. I stood there a moment longer with my hand on the doorframe. It occurred to me then that the key had never just opened a building. It had opened a ledger of character. My cousins saw money and assumed the story had ended in their favor. Barbara saw property and assumed control belonged to the loudest adult in the room. I saw a key and, for one wounded afternoon, I thought I had been made a fool of. What my grandmother saw was time. Time long enough for cash to expose appetite. Long enough for a building to reveal loyalty. Long enough for the person everyone treated like background labor to become the only one still standing when stewardship finally mattered. That is the cruel joke of many families. They build an entire internal economy around visibility. Who shines? Who charms? Who gets introduced proudly? Who gets forgiven fastest? Who is treated as future? And meanwhile, the person carrying the actual weight gets mistaken for furniture. Until the day the house shifts. Until the day the furniture speaks. Until the day a rusty key lands in the right hand. Sometimes people ask me whether I feel like I won. I understand the question. It makes narrative sense. My cousins got millions, and I got the hidden legacy. The greedy aunt was exposed. The overlooked granddaughter ended up with the real power. On paper, it scans like victory, but real life is less cinematic than that. I lost my grandmother. I lost the version of family people keep hoping can be repaired with one honest conversation and a casserole. I lost years of trying to prove myself to people who benefited from never being convinced. What I gained was better. I gained proportion. I know now that being underestimated can be a kind of camouflage. That dignity grows differently when it is not fed by applause. That responsibility is not a punishment when it is attached to meaning. And that no amount of money can save people from the consequences of believing everything exists for their consumption. The trust continues to grow. We expanded into the rear parcel without selling control. We added counseling offices and a scholarship fund for women re-entering school after family disruption or domestic instability. We named that scholarship after my mother, because she would have loved the fierce practicality of it. Erica still works at Alder House. Part-time became full-time. Full-time became competence. We are not suddenly sisters in the sentimental sense. Some ruptures do not reseal neatly, but she has learned to do honest work without decorating herself with it. And I respect that. Respect is not the same as closeness. Sometimes it is more durable. Barbara lives in another town now. Smaller house. Fewer committees. I hear things occasionally, but not enough to form a story. And I prefer it that way. Nolan, from what little reaches me, still believes life has wronged him by failing to reward confidence at the rate he expected. Some lessons cannot be taught by loss because the ego would rather accuse gravity than learn from the fall. And me? I still keep the key. It hangs on a hook inside my office at Alder House, beside the framed note in my grandmother's handwriting. Elder House. Start with the blue door. Look up. Sometimes when a new resident arrives carrying everything she owns in 2 bags, and an exhausted child, and the kind of careful face people wear when life has punished trust too often, I touch that key before I go downstairs. Not as superstition, as orientation. Because my grandmother was right. People who grab first rarely understand value. Value is not always what glitters on the conference table in front of witnesses. Sometimes value is hidden in a swollen door in a damp alley beside a building. Everyone important dismissed. Sometimes value sounds like a dead woman's voice on a cassette tape saying she knew exactly who was who. Sometimes value looks like oak floors restored under years of dirt. Sometimes value looks like a boundary held steady, long enough for chaos to tire itself out against it. And sometimes value comes to you disguised as humiliation, with rust on it, while everyone in the room smiles because they think they just watched you lose. If you made it this far, tell me this in the comments. What would you have done with the key? Sold everything? Kept the building? Exposed the family quietly or publicly? I always read those answers. As for me, I used to think my grandmother left me a key because she trusted me with a secret. Now I think she left it because she trusted me with a door. And those are not the same thing. A secret only asks to be known. A door asks whether you are strong enough to walk through. Hold it open for the right people, and lock it against the wrong ones. That key changed all of our lives. Not because it made me richer than my cousins, though in the end it did. Not because it exposed my aunt, though it did that too. It changed us because it forced every person in my family to meet the truest version of themselves. My grandmother, even after death, remained exactly who she had always been. Clear-eyed, patient, unimpressed by noise. Barbara became what greed becomes when it loses the lighting. Nolan became appetite without structure. Erica became a woman who finally had to decide whether image was enough to live inside. And I became someone I should have been much earlier. Not softer, not harder, just no longer available for consumption. That was the real inheritance. Not the deeds, not the grants, not the 17 million in value. The inheritance was learning that love without boundaries becomes a subsidy for bad character, and that the smallest object in the room can become the heaviest if it carries the truth. So yes, my cousins got millions, and I got a rusty key. I think, in the end, my grandmother knew exactly what she was doing.